the saints go marching in. Now when the saints go marching in. Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in. Sing it again. Now when the saints...
For over 20 long years, Rockstar Games has held the very fortunate and simultaneously unfortunate position of existing on the cutting edge of the video game industry. Grand Theft Auto 3 on the PS2 and Xbox effectively created the modern crime sandbox, but to limit that game's success to the development of just the open-world sandbox genre is to ignore the much larger influence GTA 3 and its subsequent sequels had on the entire industry at large. In some ways, GTA 3 was the game everyone didn't know they had always wanted, because Rockstar didn't just make a video game with levels and challenges to overcome, they create a whole modern living world, Liberty City, just as dense and populated as the real New York City, or at least as dense and populated as 2001 hardware could render. Liberty City was the playground of destruction for a low-life nobody to rise through the ranks of crimedom and become kingpin of it all. And through that setting and the many intrinsic gameplay mechanics they developed, the team at Rockstar made something that had more mass appeal than just about any other video game in history ever had before. A bar that they would continue to reach time and time again afterwards. But the explanation for how that original GTA turned out the way it did and got such a reputation so fast can be easily understood by just about anyone who's around to play it when it first came out. Same for Vice City or San Andreas. There was just really nothing else quite like this. Open-world games and sandboxes had existed before, sure, but what made Rockstar's early low-definition output so unavoidable in the 2000s was that they were the first ones to take the training wheels off. They let the players go completely nuts in a consequence-free world. Rockstar allowed people the freedom to commit acts of wanton violence in a simulated world not too dissimilar from the one they were currently living in, which at the time was a pretty big, pretty fun novelty. Like Postal, but well-designed and with some actual framework surrounding it. And you still had your open-world RPGs like in Daggerfall and then later Morrowind, and you also had the Zelda and Mario overworlds, but even considering them, there's still very few sandboxes during this time that attempted to depict some form of modern reality. Not a lot of games took themselves seriously enough to attempt that, and not a lot of games were expected to be taken seriously enough for players to desire that, especially when it came to the console market. GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas are not what I would call very serious or even particularly mature games, no matter what the rating says, but nevertheless, in the video game world of the early 2000s, they might as well have been The Sopranos and The Wire compared to the general caliber of video game characters, setting, and story we were getting back then. This is, after all, still in the era of mascots. Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, Blinks the Time Sweeper. Compare them to Claude, Carl Johnson, and Tommy fucking Vercetti. GTA 3 and its subsequent sequels had a huge impact, both in creating the typical open-world crime sandbox, but also by being one of the largest factors in transitioning the entire industry away from the cutesy, child-friendly face it had worn for so many decades. Thus, the whole industry began shifting, and the PS3, Xbox 360 era moves on from mostly being about animals doing adventures to being about white guys shooting a bunch of henchmen for various reasons, usually American glory. Rockstar wasn't the only company to take part in this transition, but they have most certainly championed their own status as pioneers of gaming innovation since then. Going into the HD Grand Theft Auto series, as well as the Red Dead Redemption series in the 2010s, Rockstar maintained rank as an industry leader, and in doing so positioned each new game to be some bigger, better technological marvel compared to what had come before. And yeah, they do have a lot of evidence to back up that claim. But in attempting this, Rockstar has also developed a tendency to indulge in some very strange and often not at all worthwhile experiments when creating their vast multi-million-dollar open worlds. Things like cousin bowling, being forced to eat healthy and work out regularly, a realistic brown-gray color palette, having every player character in every game control like their arms and legs are trying to detach from their own torso. Stuff that totally makes sense if your desire is to experiment with how to create a more realistic and interactive open world, but also stuff that doesn't really work out if you're just trying to make a fun game that people want to play and enjoy their time with. Ditto for their narratives. In Grand Theft Auto 5, and especially Grand Theft Auto 4, Rockstar made the poor choice to present their stories and characters with a tone of melodramatic seriousness that is completely unbefitting for the setting and the mindset of their player base. In addition, their narratives often fall directly against their own central gameplay loops of escalating violence that makes up most of the time the players are actually going to spend on the game. The parts that are fun about Grand Theft Auto are not often well reflected in the world of the story. In fact, much of the time, they're exact opposites of each other. These grim tales of men forced into doomed spirals because of the consequences of actions long past don't always pair well with a game where you'll probably spend most of your free time trying to see how much destruction you can rack up before your wanted level gets too high and the cops kill you. Even in side missions, it feels like the players are forced into this specific box that is completely counter to how they experience and are encouraged to interact with the rest of the game world. At some point, it just seems like Rockstar really lost track of the basic goals of a crime sandbox video game. And with GTA 6 already right around the corner, it does feel unlikely that they're going to find their way back to this old style of game design. However, it should be remembered that even by the time Rockstar got to the HD era, Grand Theft Auto wasn't the only established crime sandbox in town. And those games contributed to the genre in many unique ways that Rockstar could do well to not forget. In fact, a lot of very promising developers had come to very obviously copy off one of the most successful entertainment properties of all time, and these came and went with varying degrees of success and failure. You got your Mafia, your Crackdown, your Godfather the video game, your Sleeping Dogs, your Scarface the World is Yours, your The Simpsons Hit and Run, but none of those games would be nearly as remarkable or as comparable to Grand Theft Auto as the subject of our video today, the Saints Row series, a video game series that I like much, much more than the Grand Theft Auto series.
That's the great thing about this city. It's there for the taking, if you've got what it takes.
Developed by Volition, the Third Street Saints faced a long and turbulent history before they could even get their first game started. Volition was bred from the splitting of Parallax Software in 1997. Founders Mike Koulos and Matt Toshlog had two offices and wanted to simplify things. So, Mike kept half the team at one of their offices in Champaign, Illinois to create Volition, and Matt took half the team to their other offices in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and created Outrage Entertainment, which did not last very long. When deciding for a name for his new company, Koulos was struggling for quite a while before he happened upon a glossary and found the definition of the word volition. It was defined as an intense and active will to accomplish something. He loved it. And with that, he had his name and carried it forward through the development of games like Red Faction 1 and 2 and The Punisher for the PS2. Funnily enough, Volition was once in development of a heist game in the early 2000s called Underground, which had its whole production ruined by ballooning expectations, all caused because the marketing department at their then publisher THQ, rest in peace, was freaking the hell out over Grand Theft Auto 3's success and kept demanding more and more be added to the game until finally it collapsed under all this pressure and got cancelled. Think of this as the first strike in what can be understood as Rockstar Games and Volition's Aperture Science versus Black Mesa style war for crime sandbox supremacy. The relationship of these two real companies actually has quite a lot in common with the relationship of those two fictional companies, in that one is staggeringly more successful than the other, one very frequently steals work from the other, and one is almost completely unaware of the other's existence. I'll give you one guess who's Aperture and who's Black Mesa. Despite the obvious ambivalence to their work, both from competitors and from most of the gaming public, Volition still charged ahead with its own crime sandbox series, Saints Row, coming out with the first one in 2006, which was a total disaster. At least inside the studio. Outside, the game was released to a pretty decent reception, critically and commercially. Even if the game was branded as an extremely blatant Grand Theft Auto clone, this was still 2006. So, the Third Street Saints got to hold the title of at least being one of the very first Grand Theft Auto clones. Inside Volition, however, developers were reportedly both unhappy to be working on what was being pitched as a gang simulator, and unhappy with the behavior of upper management. In the end, Saints Row 1 was shipped, but it was finished far exceeding its $8 million budget. Taking these issues to heart, the first Saints Row game was given an extensive post-mortem analysis by those working on it at Volition. And it's probably because of this very fact that those developers were able to learn so much from their mistakes and make Saints Row 2 into the amazing open-world game that it was. Even if that first game in the series did turn out relatively successful, Koulos and his team weren't too thrilled to be labeled as the off-brand Grand Theft Auto. And so, with the sequel, they committed themselves to be different and make something that stood on its own merits. The design philosophy of Saints Row 2 was, as described by design director Scott Phillips, to just put everything into the game. And if you've played Saints Row 2 before, you know just how much those developers took this to heart. It is truly one of the most beautifully self-indulgent pieces of entertainment ever created. Well worth its acclaim. However, as it turned out, the release dates for Saints Row 2 and Grand Theft Auto 4 were dangerously close together. And even with all their gumption and superior game design philosophy, it was still definitely a competition that was not going to end in Volition's favor. They were poised to be the Lee Carvello's putting challenge to Rockstar's Bone Storm. But actually, the exact opposite occurred. Not if you look at sales or reception or anything that actually matters, but if you consider it from the perspective of this one single YouTuber and a couple of other more noteworthy individuals, Saints Row 2 is the game that Grand Theft Auto 4 should have been. Nico Bellic, Little Jacob, and Yusuf Amir aside, Grand Theft Auto 4 is a game world filled up with some of the most boring, textureless individuals ever conceived for an underground crime world sandbox. Just a bunch of miscellaneous goons and kingpins taking themselves way too seriously and all popping off with the personality and flair of a first-year film student's feature crime comedy screenplay. And not only that, but also some of the most ass-backwards gameplay innovations that has ever befallen such an otherwise popular game. Some of the many misguided ideas of good game design that the industry has still regrettably yet to walk back on were born right here. Chiefly, this asinine desire to make everything as interactable and truthful as possible. This idea that the closer we get to objective reality, the better a game will be. Let's take a look at that in practice. Because while Nico is going on fake dates and driving his shitty friends around on their errands, the custom-made boss from Saints Row 2 was flinging their ragdolled body into traffic for insurance money and spewing sewage across the neighborhood to lower the cost of real estate. You tell me which you'd rather play. The bigger that Rockstar Games got, the more they moved away from the core of what makes the crime open-world sandbox a great and unique setting in the world of gaming. It's the emphasis on the crime part. We don't play our make-believe murder time car stealy games so we can pretend to go through the gritty turmoil of an Eastern European war criminal as he confronts the disappointing realities of the American dream in his long gestating but ultimately hollow quest for revenge. We play these games so we can dress up in a silly costume and whack pedestrians in the face with a dildo bat, just like we always wanted to do in real life.
I'll show you police brutality.
Saints Row 2 is so proudly irreverent in its game design, so committed to doing things for the sake of fun above all else that it completely blows the HD Grand Theft Auto games out of the water even before they became evil through predatory microtransactions. Volition took so much care and attention to how people actually play and interact with these open-world sandboxes, and there's a real commitment to creating a story that feels appropriate both for that setting and satisfying for the player to play an active role in. To me, it's like the video game equivalent of a hangout movie. Something easy and fun and light. And I think the difference can be summed up by one of my favorite gameplay innovations added to the Saints series. In Saints Row the Third, they made it so if you're running next to a car before you attempt to carjack it, your character will just jump in through the window and kick the driver out of the car with their feet, before moving on. It is fucking hilarious every time you do it, and it is absolutely not something you could ever put in a game that takes itself as seriously as any of the Grand Theft Autos do. And yet, by adding this to one of the most important mechanics of any crime sandbox, the mechanic that Grand Theft Auto is fucking named after, Volition kind of beats Rockstar at their own game. Transportation and movement is a key factor in any open world, and a lot of games that rely on traveling by car are burdened by the same animation being played over and over again whenever you want to get anywhere. It might not really make any sense how the player character is able to pull this move off flawlessly each time, but it just feels so much better when you're playing it. The ease of jumping into a car and getting going right away whenever you need to. It is a perfect innovation on an already established game mechanic. And this is what makes the Saints great. It's this fearlessness to look like a complete idiot just so long as it's also for the sake of making the game more enjoyable for the player. Saints Row 2 is one of the best open world games ever made for this commitment alone, and it's a drive that the series carried forward with every subsequent sequel. The only acceptable alteration to the formula being go bigger than you did last time, include even more of everything. In that spirit, we got Saints Row the Third and one of my personal favorite games of all time, Saints Row 4. A wonderful, anarchic, great big parody of the whole franchise, and a hell of a finale to the game series that started with some gangbangers selling drugs outside a church. And somehow, despite those 3 back-to-back home runs, 4 if you count Get Out of Hell, the latest entry to the Saints Row series, a reboot released in 2022, was profoundly disappointing, which is about the most charitable way I could possibly describe it.
Dad, you should buckle up.
When the first trailer for Saints Row 2022 came out, fans were mostly very unhappy. There were a few arguments about how things might turn out okay, but most people were feeling pretty negative about the whole thing. When the game did actually get released, most of those people who felt unhappy got to feel totally justified for their knee-jerk reaction, as the overall consensus across the board was that Saints Row 2022 was mediocre at best. And in the world of AAA gaming, that's the equivalent of a complete dumpster fire train wreck. So much so that it killed the damn studio that made it. I am not here to point out that those people are wrong, actually, and that Saints Row 2022 is good, actually. But I do want to at least understand how we got here, and attempt to view this Saints Row reboot on its own merits, even if untangling it from the rest of the series feels kind of impossible. Like everything that's created now, Saints Row 2022 initially fell under the umbrella of idiots criticizing something for being too woke because there wasn't enough white guys in it, or because there were too many non-white guys in it, or whatever the fuck they're crying about now. And with it came a plethora of bad faith, dumbass comments that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual game being discussed, or even any actual critical points about design or development, or the purposes behind any decision made in the final product. Just a bunch of insecure people talking about things that only matter to them and using whatever the latest thing on their computer screen is as ignition for their rants. I say to those individuals, you don't need to call Saints Row 2022 a bad game because it's too woke. Not when there are so many other good reasons to call it a bad game instead. Because the Saints Row we got in 2022 wasn't just formed because people got too progressive to understand the comedic brilliance of whacking someone in the balls with a dildo bat. Something else caused this mess of a game. In fact, a lot of the ways Saints Row 2022 turned out, I feel, can be blamed on the fans. Fans just like me. I talked about my love for Saints Row 4 earlier, which, if you're unfamiliar with the Saints Row series, is a somewhat contentious opinion to have. A lot of folks fucking hated the direction the series took after Saints Row 2. Me, though, I loved it. Less mercy killings, more fun. And there are many just like me, almost as much as there are fans who disagree. Coming into the third game, and particularly after the fourth game, the Saints Row fanbase was split down the middle, with half loving the goofy, satirical direction the series had gone in following 2, and half saying it was terrible and didn't fit the series and needed to go. This became the central conundrum that Volition faced when developing their reboot. They have this great, big, established fan base, but nobody can agree on what they actually like about the game. You can't make something that's going to appeal to both of these groups of people at the same time. You can't make a spiritual successor to both Saints Row 2 and Saints Row 4, because all you'll end up with is the exact midpoint between madcap Matrix Space Odyssey and quirky Gangland crime story. And that's just Saints Row the Third again, and Volition already fucking made Saints Row the Third in 2011. So, what is the right answer here? What do we do with the Saints in 2022? It's true, I do have a desire for more unrestrained creative nonsense like what happened with 4, but when looking at this issue from a more objective perspective, one can see how this whole mess really is something that Volition probably would have done better to just outright ignore. Artists do their best work when they're making something that speaks to them and is enjoyable for them to create. And while thinking about how to go about creating their latest addition to the Saints Row canon, Volition, instead of worrying so much about what others thought, myself included, they should have just followed their hearts and done something new. Because if I got the Saints Row 5 I always wanted, it would have meant a lot of other people being very disappointed, and vice versa. So, why not just say fuck the fans? Because the path Volition ended up choosing is so full of half measures and compromises that it can't help but feel like a seriously neutered product as a result. One that's not really appealing to either side of the Saints Row fanbase. There's an air of desperation in the 2022 reboot that just wasn't there before. A cloying desire to be liked. And a lot of this, I feel, can be explained by what's happened with Volition since the release of Saints Row 4 in 2013. Since then, they only released one other full game, Agents of Mayhem, which I have not played. Agents of Mayhem was presented to me as such an odd product, a weird semi-spin-off but also multiverse collection of Saints and Red faction characters battling it out in a Saturday morning cartoon world, and I just didn't know what to make of any of it. Still don't, really. I think many others were also in that same boat, as Agents sold pretty poorly and resulted in a lot of layoffs at Volition. For those who knew about the Saints or the Red faction characters, we were just left confused as to how or why they were a part of this new game series, not even really getting to experience the nostalgia of having these characters back again, since they were effectively rewritten in this iteration as someone totally different. And for newcomers who didn't know or care about those old games, they were being presented with a weird sort of kind of sequel to a bunch of stuff they hadn't played before and had no reason to care about. Everything about Agents of Mayhem's presentation made it so off-putting for everyone, fans and newcomers alike. And a lot of this can be circled back to that insistence of not having it be a completely original work. For Volition's refusal to just move on from the Saints. In retrospect, Gat Out of Hell's multiple endings should have been seen as an ill omen for things to come, a sign that Volition was clingy. Because even following Agents of Mayhem's failures, when Volition was choosing what their next game should be, rather than build something new from the ground up, they just decided to reboot Saints Row instead, adding the promise that it would be more grounded and have a tone reminiscent of Saints Row 2, just like everyone said they wanted. Thing is, that's not true. If you played through the reboot, you know it really, really does not feel in line with Saints Row 2's tone at all, and is quite literally designed to not be grounded. Which begs the question, why even call the game Saints Row then? It's so clear just from that first trailer that the developers do not share the same sort of, and let's be frank here, cynical, over-caffeinated, unmedicated 12-year-old boy mentality that the original Saints Row series so proudly championed. And yeah, the consequences of that mentality means some aspects of the original game haven't always aged well, but neither have most games involving crime that were released in the 2000s, and most of them weren't as overtly comedic as the Saints. Which brings us back to the original problem with the reboot. It really is not trying to be funny, or rather it really isn't succeeding at being funny like the other games were. It's also probably worth mentioning that two of the most important key creative voices of the original Saints Row series, the aforementioned project lead / design director Scott Phillips and lead writer / studio creative director Steve Jaros, had left Volition before this reboot got going. Mike Koulos and some remaining employees like director Brian Traficante were all that were left, and Mike was only returning after years away from the company. So it does make sense that this reboot does feel like it's missing something innate to the Saints' character. It certainly feels like it's coming from a place of outsider admiration more than it's coming from people who were actually on the ground floor of each of the original gameplay and narrative decisions. The shadow of Mass Effect Andromeda weighs heavy on this Saints Row reboot. Like that game, it feels like Saints Row 2022 is being created by fans who know what they like about the original games, but don't know how to recreate those things that they like. Again, I must reiterate that the best possible choice was probably just to not even try. Forgiving the loss of key creatives and the desire to appease a plethora of disparate fans, this is a different team of people from the ones who created Saints Row 4, and especially from the ones who created Saints Row 2. They were never going to be able to capture that original Saints Row magic. Instead, they should have just tried for an original idea from someone within the company. And that game could have been grounded or goofy on its own merits without holding up the legacy of an old game franchise that only a few nerds like me care about. That is exactly how the first Saints Row game was created all those years ago. An original idea from someone creative working at the studio.
It's the Saints! They exposed the frontier. They robbed my train. They ruined my good name.
We've done the risk assessment, and you are a liability.
Bullshit.
This puts the core concept at the heart of Saints Row 2022 into question all before development has even begun. Should it exist? Probably not. Should it be a direct sequel to Saints Row 4, or a follow-up to one of the Get Out of Hell endings? Also probably not, we already know how that turns out. So then should it instead be a reboot? Oh, definitely not. What the hell is the point in rebooting the Saints if the entire fan base can't even decide what the Saints actually are? That's 0 for 3. Not a great start, admittedly, and not made better by a lot of the choices made during game development. Though working through COVID couldn't have made things easy. When we finally got Saints Row 2022, it was marked by all this shit weighing it down. And if you're wondering how Volition attempted to push past this and resolve these many conflicts, the answer is simple and one that I explained already. They split the difference and basically just made Saints Row the Third again, crossing their fingers and hoping that that would appease everyone. They followed through on this, with most of Saints Row the Third's tone and execution and more than a few gameplay mechanics carrying over, but otherwise kept it to a new world with a new cast of new Saints. The Saints Row 2022 reboot is, for better and for worse, a fateful recreation of one of those old open-world crime sandboxes that filled the late 2000s and early 2010s and have mostly disappeared since then. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I like Saints Row the Third, and I hadn't played it in a really long time, so any game that could remind me of it is definitely worth a closer look at least. When actually playing through the Saints Row reboot and experiencing all it has to offer, you can start to see how surprisingly well-designed and functionally fun this throwback is. And coming from all this weight on its shoulders, it is pretty staggering how good Saints Row 2022 feels to play. Even as a blatant copy of one of these old sandboxes, it still manages to be an excellent example of one of these old sandboxes. And for a game like this to still come out in 2022, well, that's a pretty cool thing to see. In fact, while playing it, one might be confused as to why Saints Row 2022 still has the reputation that it does today, and why it didn't go on to do any better commercially than it did, and then they'll play some more and they'll get to a cutscene and they will instantly understand why. Every single flaw in Saints Row 2022 can be circled back to 3 words: Eli, Kevin, and Nina. The friends. The new Saints. The characters who hold the special distinction of being so awful and unlikable they completely torpedo the entire game that they star in. And it's not a small factor either. Volition went all in on these 3 bastards, put them front and center, made them the main cast, and hinged the entire narrative crux of the story on the player character's investment in them, which is a big fucking problem because just about everyone who plays this game absolutely fucking hates them. I am no exception. And it really boggles my mind just how much of a colossal screw-up this is. Like, something like this happening is rare, and it deserves to be studied for how unlikely it is. Most of the time when a game or any piece of art is undone, it's not by something so unintegral to the rest of the work. This is a violent video game, damn it, not some lame book with words in it. These characters shouldn't hold so much sway, but they do. Eli, Kevin, and Nina are just horrendous. Unappealing, annoying, unlikable, uninspired, boring, lazy Zoomer millennial caricatures that actively made me not want to play Saints Row. And they are actually where I think a lot of that quote-unquote woke criticism comes from. The overall tone and vibe of Saints Row 2022 is one of how do you do, fellow kids, and as such it is chock full of a bunch of late 30-year-olds' ideas of what's cool and how people in their 20s talk and act. The script for this game is a poster child for the type of lame depictions of modern-day young people living that its attempts to be hip and relevant make the characters of Saints Row 2022 and the writers themselves look like a bunch of fucking dorks. The Saints in this reboot are 4 young, struggling roommates trying to find their place in the world of American late-stage capitalism, and they might just make it yet through the love and friendship that they share with each other. These are the people who will build a vast criminal conspiracy that takes over fake Las Vegas. These people, who spend most of the game talking about how much they love being friends with each other. These people, who behave like the cast of New Girl. Our kingpins. Somehow. Over and over and over and over again while playing this game, I found myself asking one question. Volition, what the hell do you think a criminal gang is? Why does this version of the Saints feel like more of a casual social club for college dropouts than like a real organization with leaders that actually do anything, much less anything criminal? And look, I'm not saying the original Saints Row always had a great understanding of what crime is, but that was at least often part of the joke, usually defended by some weird in-game bullshit mechanic like the Professor Genki reality show. But now that we've taken a small page out of the Rockstar Games self-seriousness book, we need to deal with those same consequences that they dealt with. There's a scene early on that spells out why this is such a stupid direction for a Saints Row game to go in. Nina has these collections of missions where you help her find her old car that was stolen, only for the mission to end with the car being destroyed anyway. She gives this big speech about how important the car was because it reminds her of her mother who died of cancer and her family back home and how important their relationship is to her. And meanwhile, I'm just sitting off to the side thinking about how many kids I made into orphans from all the car chase murdering we did in this very mission, and how many more people all of these characters are going to indiscriminately kill over the course of the game. If Nina or any of the other Saints were depicted with more negative characteristics, then maybe this would have gone down smoother and not felt so tonally out of place in the game, but that is not what happens. There is absolutely no level of seriousness extended to anything in the world of the Saints Row reboot except for the main character's internal personal struggles. And that makes the entire world feel so fucking pointless, and the perspective of the writers seem very vapid and downright narcissistic. It might have been helped if these attempts at characterization were at least interesting or fun instead of annoying, but they aren't. The game just refuses to create any conflict within this friend group, and it suffers so much because of that. When we are introduced to Nina, Eli, Kevin, and the player character, they all love each other so damn much, and have so many quirky roommate inside jokes with each other, and they're all just so fucking sweet all the fucking time. It is maddening. It falls along the same sanctimonious fake sitcom bullshit that was mocked in Saints Row 4 with that Leave It to the Saints simulator. That was a depiction of the boss's worst nightmare, and here it is, happening in reality. For an example of what I'm talking about, take the absolute worst one of them all, homosexual Simu Liu, or Kevin as the game likes to call him. There is no reason for Kevin to appear in the narrative at all. He doesn't add much to the crew, he doesn't say anything funny, and every time he was on screen, I wanted the game to be shut off. He is truly useless. And look, all of the main three friends don't really contribute much to the Saints organization. You, the player character, basically do everything, and it does leave you wondering, what do any of these people actually have to offer to a gang at all? Nina is at least outlined as a mechanic and skilled driver, with some grit to her, even if they do ruin it with this overextended art history major background that feels so tacked on and does nothing really beyond making her lame. She has student loans, isn't that so relatable? Eli, you could also potentially work into something interesting for the Saints story. He's positioned as the brains behind the operation, and he does have some interesting edges to him, as being the only Saint with no previous affiliation to another group, as well as clearly being the most money-hungry out of all of them. That could have been an interesting thread to develop, but instead Saints Row 2022 uses this discount Steve Urkel as a vehicle for a bunch of live-action role-playing missions, which made up some of the worst parts of the entire game for me. Again, I asked myself, why are members of a criminal gang doing shit like this, and why did the developers think that it would be fun? Pretend murder within our murder simulator? Why? But I digress, because despite Nina and Eli's less than desirable qualities, neither of them come close to Kevin. He contributes absolutely nothing. He's a cook, and he used to be a member of one of the Saints' rival gangs, the iconoclastic Idols group. But really, in practice, he is just a gay, shirtless Joey. At best, a mascot for the team, which is totally unneeded since the roommates already have a cute cat filling that role. Every criticism that can be levied at the friends is 3 times as worse for him. His dumb guy face just showing up in scenes and on my phone to spout some of the most brain-dead, smug, self-effacing comments that I've ever had the displeasure of hearing from an NPC. You could force-feed an AI nothing but Marvel one-liners and Jimmy Fallon opening monologues, and it would still come up with dialogue better than his. You know how much of an achievement it is to make someone embarrassed while they're playing a game alone with nobody else even in the house? That's what Saints Row 2022 did to me. That's what these 3 characters did. That's what Kevin did to me. Over and over and over again, no matter how much I begged him to stop. And really, if they didn't press so hard on these forced smile personalities and actually let these people interact like real friends who bicker and occasionally disagree with each other about things, it might have not been so bad. The elephant in the room with all of this is that they're clearly trying to position these characters in the same way the original Saints were positioned, to give the players the same feelings they got from their old crew. And no matter what criticism can be rightfully or wrongfully lobbed at the original series, you can't deny that its one great saving grace was how likable and fun all of the original Saints were as a team. They were a group of friends first, and this is what made so many moments like singing along to classic hits in the car rides towards missions so memorable. But the original Saints weren't a bunch of Care Bears. They had rough edges, they had internal goals that would conflict with others, and desires beyond their friends. For example, take Pierce Washington, who really isn't a character that I particularly love all that much. Kinsey Kensington will forever be my favorite Saint. But the original Saints Row series ended up using him very effectively as the group's heel, the one that everyone always constantly undermines and underestimates. And in doing so, Volition made a character that I initially had no feelings for grow into someone I was actually sort of really attached to. Because even though Pierce may have not exactly always fit in with the rest of these murder-hungry gangsters, he still had a place in the ever-changing group dynamic that was always fun to see exercised. And we just pick him up randomly off the street during one mission. It's not like he had this grand, detailed backstory rife for exploration. They built him up naturally across several games. Pierce is the one my boss was singing all those classics with, and that repeated joke is something that could really only be done with Pierce and none of the other crew members. The boss even tries it with Kinsey once, and she immediately shuts him down. Not a single character in Saints Row 2022 is even remotely close to this level of depth. They aren't even on the same level as the floating eyeball who gives you head in Saints Row 4. Instead, Saints Row 2022 feels like you were invited to a party with a bunch of people who all know each other and who don't know you, and also for some reason they're wearing your old friend's clothes. All of them are having a good time, but you're just left feeling like an intruder. Because you don't fucking know any of these people, and if you don't know any of them, why should you fucking like them? The reboot's overall campaign could change that through a couple of character arcs, but the game never really goes on long enough to get that opportunity. It's all premise, no follow-through.
Not bad at all.
The boss is introduced in the starting missions as working for Marshall, a private security company with a cyberpunk dystopia budget, and one of the few parts of the reboot that is directly borrowed and mostly unchanged from the previous games. To Saints Row 2022's very slim credit, I will say that the character of the boss is probably the only one out of the cast in this game who isn't complete ear poison. The original boss in Saints Row 2-4 is, to me, one of the best examples of utilizing a custom player-created character effectively for a video game story. Better than Commander Shepard even, I mean it. The boss is simultaneously infinitely customizable, and yet also a very well-defined character within their own right. This non-binary, puckish rogue Jane Austen fanatic really does shine brightly throughout the series that heralds their rise to galactic presidential glory. There was once this popular comment that Stephen Ogg's Trevor from Grand Theft Auto V was a perfect encapsulation of the mindset of the typical GTA player, but I disagree. Mostly because Trevor can be so downright evil and mean-spirited in a way that only really flies in a game world with some real stakes and consequences to it, and that's just not really what I want to experience. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm not trying to engage with these open-world crime sandboxes as exercises in realism. I'm here to have some fun, and that is who the boss is, a fella who likes to have fun. They love blowing stuff up and making money and stripper poles and vengeance. They are a 13-year-old boy's idea of the coolest type of person you could ever possibly be, and that's just great because it fits in so nicely with the goals of the original series. Saints Row 2022 might fail a lot of its characters, but it does manage to bring the boss into the future mostly unscathed. Like their earlier counterparts, the 2022 boss is a little green around the gills at first, but is still just as mischievous and ready to commit mass violence as ever before. Unfortunately, this does have the side effect of making the boss stand out pretty loudly in this game, because they are the only ones who are ever actually doing anything. It is basically just a one-person crime family. And admittedly, even though for most of the game I found myself loving this boss, the last couple of missions kind of fucked that up, and as you can expect, it is related to the three friends. See, the overall story of Saints Row 2022 is a classic crime ascension tale, virtually no different from almost every other open-world crime sandbox game ever made. The boss lives with their three roommates who all love each other very much and yet still work for competing organizations, the rival gangs that will make up most of the enemies you face. You have the previously mentioned militarized marshal, the anarcho-communists of the Idols, and finally the much more traditional gang of Los Panteros. All of you quit your respective groups after being betrayed by all of your respective bosses and come to the obvious conclusion that working for the man gets you nowhere. So you elect to instead become the man by creating your own gang that is totally better and morally different from the other gangs in some strange abstract way. The foursomes start broke and desperate, but watch how they overcome adversity by stealing a bunch of property from one guy and instantly using that property to develop a vast network of criminal enterprises which affords them millions overnight. However, unlike the rival gangs, the Saints are the good guys because... yet, the story never really figures that one out. The original Saints never had to worry about this because they were always very clearly a bunch of dicks and everybody knew it. The reboot is trying a bit harder, but that doesn't really end up amounting to much. There's a brief mention in one of Nina's missions about how maybe it is a little hypocritical for the roommates to be profiting so much off of their subordinates' work. A gang is, after all, at the end of the day, just a pyramid scheme, but this is quickly shut down and never brought up again. Also complicating things is the Idols, who, at least based on all the gesturing towards vaguely progressive anti-corporation ideals that this game parrots, would make you think that Volition would want to show them in a slightly more sympathetic light, but the Idols are still depicted as clear-cut villains like the rest of the gangs. Very out-of-date villains, I might add. The general direction they take with the Idols is a Hacker Anonymous style group with a Daft Punk wardrobe change, and like the rest of the game, it is just so painfully out of touch. The Idols do a bunch of drugs and murder and crash a bunch of parties and have a giant, gross-looking tent city commune for their members to live in. One of those classic cases of, oh, the people wanting change are actually bad guys because they're too violent, and they're actually ineffective, and don't have a real plan, and actually the leaders are all a bunch of hypocrites. It's not even real anarcho-communism anyway, so it doesn't count. That shit is old and tired and boring, and likewise forces the Saints into a very uncomfortable position where they have to be proven as the better option. But doing so would require making something close to a political statement, and publishers have become absolutely horrified at the prospect of brushing up against anything even close to the P word. Volition clearly didn't have a clue what to do with the Idols, and in the end they just decided to make the Saints the better option because they are the more successful group, mostly when measured financially. This is the only real reason the game lands on. Worthington's Law. If someone has more money than you, that probably just means they're better than you. I don't think that's what the developers of this game actually believe, but it is certainly what the game very heavily implies with how that part of the narrative unravels. Although, to be fair to the developers, one cannot come away from playing the Saints Row reboot without getting the severe sense that something is missing, that a lot of cuts were probably made during production. Playing through the story, things move along at a pretty typical pace for this type of game. You do the starting missions that show you the tutorials, then you start the gang and get your headquarters, and as you do that, the different activities around the world open up to you. You do that side content to unlock the story missions, then you do the story missions to make progress against one of the rival gangs, and slowly turn the map purple. All in all, pretty well in line with the Saints Rows of the past. But then I got to the mission that I thought was the end of the first act, but was actually the lead-in to the final act. A train heist mission that ends with you killing the leader of the Los Panteros gang, and there had been quite a lot of build-up to get you there, with the Saints even adding a new member of the gang, an actual capable criminal, the Nahuali. I thought this was the first in a set of 3, where we would move on to the next gang, do a bunch of mini-missions to build up to the big mission where we kill their leader, and then go for the final gang in the third act. But instead, in the very next mission, we deal with the Idols, and only 2 missions later, we completely finish off with Marshall in a couple of very hastily scrubbed-together plots. It was disappointing, and made all the worse by what was awaiting me at the end of the game. Having achieved everything we set out to do, the Saints hold a big party that's foreshadowed in the game's opening and ends with the Nahuali burying the boss alive because, and I shit you not, this is the actual reason in the game, I didn't believe it when I was playing it, but this is what the Reggers actually fucking decided. The Nahuali buries the boss because he wanted to steal the boss's friends because he's jealous of your friendship with them. The Nahuali literally forces the three of them to act out a little stage play where they pretend to be his friends to a bunch of armed guards, and this is somehow something that we are supposed to take seriously. And you know, even putting aside that whole friendship is magic-ass plotline, it is such a huge mistake to make the crux of this narrative climax depend on the player's investment in these three friends. Even if I did like these guys, it's just so weird and again reinforces that the boss is the only one capable of actually doing anything. It also really doesn't help that the first mission in the game is the boss locking up the Nahuali in a pretty spectacular fashion. So this new great big final threat is someone we've already beaten before in a better way. Other than some fun asides into a trippy board game world, the end mission is like most of the story that preceded it. Extremely fucking lame. You chase the Nahuali, and for the first time in any game ever, you have a boss fight with a helicopter. A very buggy boss fight, I might add, that concludes with a trip up to the roof and a stupid, quick-time, contextual button-press Mexican standoff to close things out. But not really, because we still got one more thing to do. Clearly cribbing off the inspired use of licensed music from the previous entries in the Saints Row series, this reboot ends by giving all the cast an opportunity to sing Love Shack together, because that's a song that totally relates to the events of the game. This was the piece de resistance, the final bit of cringe to put atop the gigantic pile of cringe that had been building since the game started. And honestly, while watching it, reeling backwards at what was being shoved in my face, a better part of me was able to take over, and I couldn't help but think, you know, there's nothing inherently wrong with this scene. It's a fun secret ending for a game, and at least looks like the voice actors are enjoying themselves. It's not cynical, it's not something put into a game by people who don't care. It's put there because the developers genuinely thought it would be something fans would enjoy. They didn't, at all, but would I or any other Saints fans really be cringing so hard if this exact scene took place at the end of Saints Row 2, 3, or 4 with any of those characters? Probably not. In fact, it would probably give me the same reaction I had while watching the This Is How We Do It ending for Saints Row 4. But the thing is, I really like those characters. I slowly grew invested in them, and after all these hours of playing Saints Row 2022, I just grew to dislike everyone in it more and more. There's nothing really that wrong about that ending karaoke scene, and yet I and almost everyone else who's seen it has had such a negative reaction to it. I think because it's just so goddamn unearned. Nothing worse than celebrating when you have nothing to celebrate. That ending is a testament to the failures of this reboot. Its narrative, its characters, its fundamental choices. The whole damn story is such a big, fucking embarrassing mess. What else can I say?
The Saints could use a guy with some common sense.
But hey, you know, whatever. Shitty characters and a bad script are one thing, but they aren't enough to completely upend a game's quality. After all, as any Hideo Kojima fan can tell you, if the dialogue in a cutscene is annoying, well, that's just why God invented the skip cutscene button. And if the developers won't give us the courtesy of muting cringy dialogue themselves, then we can just do it for them. Or maybe even put on a video essay in the background to drown out the game while we play it. There is always another option, even if it is often an annoying, unintuitive option. The ultimate question is the game surrounding it worth all that bullshit just to play it? And in the case of the Saints Row reboot, the answer is yeah, sort of, kind of, a little bit. Despite itself, Saints Row 2022 is a pretty fun time, much like its forefathers. And it's very difficult for me to just chuck the whole reboot in the bin, even while understanding how and why it has the reputation that it does. I just can't be too mean to a video game that lets you traverse around the map by flying through the air and bouncing off pedestrians' heads to get more upward momentum. Any game that has that in it can't be all bad. And Saints Row 2022 isn't all bad. In fact, a lot of it is quite good. Not as good as any other entry in the series, but occasionally it does get very close to reaching that same bar, and you know what? I'll take it. Saints Row 2022 carries with it something that has been sorely missing from most AAA development. Good old-fashioned, all-American fun. By which I mean explosions. Dumb shit. Michael Bay shit. Something that has been lacking from most games for a while now, as Rockstar and Naughty Dog took us down the Oscar bait-laden path of hyper-self-serious melodrama. Coupled this with the fact that, all in all, Saints Row 2022 is a fairly well-designed game with many complementary systems that all feed into the core gameplay loop quite seamlessly, and it does make tarring and feathering this work a little bit more difficult. Going back to my original Rockstar Games bashing, I feel this Saints Row game made in the 2020s follows through on the main promise of a playground of destruction far better than Rockstar has shown themselves to be capable of. That's truthfully because the industry has long moved past this sort of game. So, for some, I can understand why a throwback like this will feel lazy, but personally, I adored it. I miss this side of gaming. I miss the just causes, the prototypes, the mercenaries, the destroy all humans, even Red Faction, come to think of it. What happened to games that understood the simple joys of letting a player control a bull in a china shop? The games that were really just a long list of fucked up things you could do to pedestrians and their vehicles. Some might cast these type of works down as low class or even lazy, but I do think not nearly enough respect is given to those games that actually manage to pull it off and create a worthwhile experience for their players. As a great critic once said, it takes a lot of care to make something that looks truly carefree. The Saints Row reboot was the latest to do it, and for that fact alone, it's worth covering your ears and walking past the friends to see what fun there is to be had inside. Functionally, Saints Row 2022 is designed to always be pushing you to interact with its world. And say, unlike a more modern Rockstar-style game, it doesn't do this by unloading a bunch of systems and contextual minigames that are used once and dropped a second later because, again, Saints Row 2022 isn't trying to create that type of grounded tone and setting. Saints Row 2022 wants you to be on a high that you never come down from, and it uses every single trick in its limited forms of gameplay to do exactly that. You're either shooting and driving, or flying. Occasionally you also take pictures. These are the only ways that you can interact with the world, and the game doesn't cheat it either with a bunch of specific one-off mechanics either. Saints Row 2022 is very old school by the book in this regard, and basically every other regard too. Thankfully, they fill in the world with enough variations on each of these gameplay interactions to make something worthwhile. Sometimes it's as simple as gaining respect when you drift or drive into oncoming traffic, and sometimes it's a lot more complicated. When the player gets to the point where they unlock the church headquarters, they also unlock criminal ventures which they can buy to build up their criminal empire. These are various business fronts who engage in criminal activity, but more importantly, they open up a bunch of side content to complete all over the map. Once you do all those missions, that specific section of the map is turned purple, and the criminal business is able to operate independently of you, and you don't have to do any missions if you don't want to. They'll just pay you the money directly. All sounds pretty in line with the other Saints Row games, huh? But with just a bit of tweaking, Volition really managed to get the most out of this system. In Saints Row's past, you were just a landlord, buying out property and reaping the rewards from them. But now you actually get to do some stuff with your acquisitions. The side content is especially helped by how many variations they include within these criminal ventures. There's of course old favorites like mayhem and insurance fraud, but also new ones, like this tech incubator that has you testing out new gadgets and weapons, and also a karate dojo that has its own mini tournament arc. And as much as I talked shit about the friends, in practice, this type of side content is what a player will spend most of their time doing in Saints Row 2022, which is nice, because it leaves the opportunity to put wide gaps in between story missions where you have to interact with the friends. Speaking of which, there is an excellent amount of ludonarrative synchronicity going on in this Saints Row that I really wasn't expecting when I first started out. Volition's developers made the very wise decision to block off story missions until a certain amount of side content was completed, and doing so helps it feel more natural as you build up your prestige in the criminal world, since it's directly reflected in the main campaign. And again, the side content just feels so clever in how it's spaced out across the map, how the player has to unlock certain expensive criminal ventures first before they can interact with new missions, thus letting the missions, whether they be main story or side content, be paced out across the game's narrative naturally, instead of just unloading you with a bunch of icons all over the map once you start. A player can tackle it right away if they want, or they can just fuck around all over the game world and they'll still likely end up making progress. I adore whenever open world games do this. It's such a treat for players because it allows them to interact with the world in the way that it was clearly designed to be interacted with, and entirely at their own pace. The main flaw of almost every open world game is the lack of freedom experienced during story missions, versus the almost universal freedom allowed from the entire rest of the game. Saints Row 2022 doesn't solve this problem, but it does push as much content as it can onto that free-flowing open-world playground part that they want the player to be enjoying most often. At almost every turn, Saints Row is pushing you forward. You, the player character, rising in status in the game world, getting access to bigger and better guns and cars as you get better at the game. Narratively, this is just some weak sauce typical, I'm gonna be the boss of this whole city one day, you'll see. But mechanically, it means getting flying death motorcycles and the aforementioned ability to bounce off people's heads while flying. They even take it further once the game ends by giving you the option to play with all these different, very creative cheat options that are all extremely silly and easily accessed. Again, just funneling more down further and further into the main, all-important goal of creating something that just feels good and fun to play. Every idea Volition has springs forth from this desire. There's a mechanic where the player rides on the roof of a car shooting enemies that they were clearly very proud of given how many times they use it in the game. But it speaks to this aesthetic that they're trying to achieve, this Michael Bay, James Wan type deal. It shines through stronger than almost anything else put in this game, and it's what carried me to the story's end, and what made me put in the effort to turn all of the areas of the map purple. There are many flaws one can point to when talking about Saints Row 2022, but very few, if any of them, are related to the gameplay. I can understand if someone is maybe just not into this or doesn't want to play something that feels like an only slightly different game from one they already played 4.5 times already 10 years ago. But for me, it was everything I was looking for. Something light and breezy and easy to pick up and easy to put down and filled with stuff that you don't see often in video games anymore, and I think that is a hell of an achievement for Volition to be able to pull off today. Shame that none of that matters, though.
That's, enlightening. But what?
You gotta follow your dreams, kids. Because if you don't, you know what happens? You're gonna become your parents. How fucking depressing would that be? Think about it.
When they were still with us, Volition did not have an easy life. They changed hands between many different publishers, first getting bought out by THQ in 2001, then when THQ went bankrupt in 2011, they were bought by Koch Media and integrated into Deep Silver. Then Embracer Group, which was formerly THQ Nordic AB, bought out Koch Media in 2018, and that meant that during their last years, Volition was being thrown around Embracer's inner workings with reckless abandon. If you don't know about them, they're the company whose current fuck-ups also cost us the KOTOR remake last year. I can only wish them and their board great pain and strife in the coming future. The last thing the developers at Volition worked on was the third and final DLC for the reboot, called A Song of Ice and Dust, released on August 8th, 2023. Volition was shut down on August 31st, 2023. That fucking stings. But it is to be expected at this point. I myself didn't buy the DLC because it was all in on the LARPing stuff, and I had already experienced more than enough of that from the main game. In fact, honestly, I haven't spent any money at all on Saints Row 2022. I got it for free on PlayStation Plus, and you want to know what's worse? It wasn't even my PlayStation Plus account. I used my brother's. Really, that's the perfect circumstances to play this game under, though. Had I spent full price on release, then I might not have felt so inclined to give it such a fair shake, especially with what other people have told me about the bugs at launch. But hell, had I even paid the $40 for the DLC, I think I would have still felt a little more disappointed than I am now. That's the issue with talking about Volition's untimely demise. It's totally unfair, and let's be real, just a straight up dick move to do this to a bunch of your employees, regardless of what was happening behind the scenes to justify it. But at the same time, when I look back at Volition's recent history, and I look at the end product they delivered, I can't really say I'm surprised that this happened to them. The credits are so joyful and vibrant and full of pictures of the entire staff working on the game, and even that embarrassing karaoke finale is kinda earnest, even if it is totally lame. The first thing you see in the reboot's credits is a dedication to longtime Volition QA tester Joseph Wells and longtime Saints Row modder Mike Watson, or Idle Ninja. Watson was responsible for a number of PC mods for the series, most notably the Gentleman of the Row mod for Saints Row 2 that basically turned the game from unplayable to playable on PCs, since the port for Saints 2 was always notoriously bad. When Volition was still around, there was even a plan to integrate Watson's patch into the Steam version of the game, but with Volition out of business, that's no longer happening, and the shitty Steam version is here to stay. Now, it's pretty tough to try to experience the story of the original 3rd Street Saints. Each iteration varies in how reliably you can play it without crashing, and how easy it is to legally find them. After finishing Saints Row 2022, I made the mistake of buying the remaster of Saints Row the Third, which I hadn't realized is a remaster that sits alongside the PS3 HD Silent Hill remake, and also the GTA Definitive Edition as remasters that totally shit the bed. The Saints Row Third remaster looks awful, runs worse than the main game, and features some weird artistic and character design changes that go completely against the tone and feeling of the Saints. It was a stark realization playing through the opening of that remaster and seeing how it had been updated to remove all the charm and personality from its world, and how every character model now is incapable of emoting in any way. All of this impressive sheen and expensive lighting effects that come together to make everything look so fucking bland. The bastards did it. They finally did it. They made the Saints look realistic. The one thing that a Saints Row game has absolutely no business being at all. Seeing that happen to Saints Row the Third, of all games, really was the final nail in the coffin for me. The thing that made me truly grasp that it was all over. Not the reboot. The reboot was just an unfortunate misstep that should have never occurred, and after all, the Saints are defined by how much they learn from their mistakes, how much they've changed with each subsequent game, and that's why that remaster is sacrilege and the reboot isn't. The reboot could have been saved in the sequel, but the remaster is actively going back in time to shit on the past for profit, to make the Saints look more like they belong in a game made by Rockstar. I feel no joy in tearing down Saints Row 2022, and I can only express sadness for the many people who worked on this game, even if it didn't ultimately come out the way anyone wanted. The future of the Saints will be left in the hands of whoever ends up keeping the rights, but I wouldn't be surprised if, like Volition, this is their last hurrah. I don't think there is a lot of goodwill left in this franchise, and if that is going to be the case, then please, at the very least, let's not let this game series or this company pass on without remembrance. Both for the effort that was put into this series and the spirit of game design that Volition carried through them all. The Saints from 2006 all the way to 2022 always had their eyes on the prize, and that prize was joy. That prize was having a good time, often in the most sophomoric way possible. What made the Saints great has always been this incredible amount of concerted effort that was put into it despite this fact. Volition never rested on the obvious truth that what they were making was ultimately crass and stupid as an excuse to be lazy about it. Again, it's not like we're talking about the Postal series here. Volition tried as hard as they could, often to an embarrassing degree, to make something so fucking cool and sweet and awesome that they very frequently did achieve exactly that. There is no reason to be ashamed of being stupid, especially when you're this good at it. Saints Row 2022 is not a perfect game, but it carries with it this spirit of stupidity that I hope those many individuals who worked on it will carry into their future creative endeavors. Volition may not be Rockstar Games, but they have just as much to teach us about how to design a sandbox. The world still needs its Saints, and let's hope this isn't the end of them. I'm Jane Vadarama. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you watch the next one too. Goodbye.